Hey, Ski. Good to see you.
Yes, sir. Pete, good afternoon. Great to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be in Springfield, if only virtually.
Amen to that. You know, this is your second time with us. Back in summer of 2011, you spent time with us, if you remember.
I remember it fondly.
You came and we invited some World War II veterans, some Korean War veterans, some peacetime veterans, some Vietnam veterans. You had dinner with us, and then spoke for a two-part series on D-Day. And you spoke to a full house. And so we're thrilled that you took your time to spend time with us today. It's been a magnificent symposium, and we're going to have you our cleanup batter, so to speak. For those of you who are with us, this is Dr. Pete Mansoor. He's a 1982 graduate from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He doesn't like to be made known, I don't think, too much, but he was first in his class. He finished as a second lieutenant, and from there he spent different times, variety of staff and command assignments. So he taught back at West Point in 93 and 95, and from there he was sent to combat deployments to Iraq. For the 1st Brigade and the 1st Armored Division, he was a colonel. While there, he was a recipient of a Bronze Star for valor, and he founded the founding director of the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center in Kansas. But what's really neat that I really found fascinating through reading through some bios of his is that he was part of the Council of Colonels, which is a task force created by Joint Chiefs of Staff to re-examine the strategy of the Iraqi War. He advocated sending additional troops. It was called the Surge. General Petraeus apparently must have liked what he had seen, so Pete became his executive officer during the period of time of the surge between 2007 and 2008. And one historian described Pete as one of the two most important advisors to General Petraeus. He retired with his colonel rank intact in 2008. He received his master's degree from the Ohio State University, Department of History, and then his PhD from the Ohio State University Department of History. He has several books out. The one this one is called Midnight at Baghdad.
Baghdad at Sunrise.
Yeah, Baghdad at Sunrise. That was close. It was close. But this is the one that I have that called The Surge. This one is a big one. You might want to really see both of them. I would almost guess they're like memoirs type of thing that you did. And the last time we spoke, you were working on a project on the Philippines. Is that
the liberation of the Philippines? I'm hoping to finish that up and get it published next year. Inshallah.
All right. Well, now he is the department chair of the Military History Department at the Ohio State University, which is the #1 military history department in the United States. So it is with our esteemed privilege and honor that we introduce to you Dr. Pete Mansoor from Ohio State University.
Well, thanks, Ski. And thank you for the invitation to speak. I know this is not a Civil War topic, but it is a topic on leadership. Right. And I think in that sense, it's germane to the theme of this conference. You know, I think it's really ironic that two of the greatest generals in U.S. Army history, Dwight Eisenhower and George C. Marshall, never saw combat. Both of them were architects of victory of the Grand Alliance in World War II, and they had different strengths. Marshall was the consummate strategist and administrator, but Eisenhower's skills lay elsewhere in his ability to manage a very difficult alliance, especially the egos and personalities of some larger than life subordinates like Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, General George S. Patton Jr., and Omar Bradley. And so this presentation is going to focus on Eisenhower and his relationship with these three key subordinates. Born in Denison, Texas in 1890, Ike, as he was known, graduated in the West Point class of 1915. In West Point lore, the class the stars fell on, because so many of the 164 graduates earned the rank of at least one-star general or more. Ike was obviously the star of that class, but he wasn't necessarily a star cadet. He graduated 61st academically out of 164 graduates. So somewhere maybe just above the mid tier. He missed combat in World War I, spending the war as a commander of a tank training center in the United States. And this disheartened him. He thought he had missed the big one, and that his future promotion opportunities would therefore be limited. But in the interwar period, his abilities came to light, and he had several key assignments that marked him for higher command. The first was in the Panama Canal Zone with Major General Fox Connor. Now, Fox Connor is not a really well-known figure in the Army today, but he was one of the stars in the Army in World War I and the interwar period. He didn't see service in World War II. And it was really Fox Connor that mentored Eisenhower and gave him his education in strategy and military history, assigning him books to read and so forth. Eisenhower then went to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, graduating first in his class in 1926. So you could see that his academic abilities had been honed by Fox Connor, and now he was on his way. And 2 years later, he graduated from the Army War College. And those two schools, the Army Command and General Staff School and the Army War College, if you graduated from both of them, it really marked you for higher command should war ever come. Eisenhower served as an aide to General Douglas MacArthur when MacArthur was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. And then MacArthur retired in 1935 and went to the Philippines to assume command of their armed forces at the invitation of the Filipino president. And MacArthur took several U.S. Army staff officers with him, and Eisenhower was one of those. Eisenhower, had a hot and cold relationship with MacArthur, but their close relationship really degenerated in the Philippines. MacArthur, thought very highly of himself, demanded a lot of perks, and demanded total loyalty and fealty from those around him. And this really turned Eisenhower off. An unfortunate incident in 1938, when MacArthur wrongly questioned Eisenhower's integrity in order to basically protect MacArthur from something the Filipino president didn't want. And MacArthur basically blamed it on his staff, when in fact he had ordered them to do it, really turned Eisenhower off. Eisenhower almost left the Philippines right then and there. And his relationship with MacArthur was never the same again. MacArthur replaced Eisenhower as his chief of staff with Major Richard K. Sutherland, and Sutherland would remain with MacArthur through the remainder of World War II, and he would have a very checkered relationship with MacArthur as well. In fact, there's a two-part biography of Sutherland, and the first part is, the subtitle is The Good Years, and the second part, the subtitle is The Bad Years. So you could see MacArthur had a way of turning his subordinates off at times. Towards the end of World War II, when Eisenhower's fame had surpassed even that of MacArthur, someone asked MacArthur if he had known Eisenhower, to which he replied, "The best clerk I ever had." And as for Eisenhower, he sarcastically summed up his time serving with MacArthur, stating, "I studied dramatics under him for 7 years." Now, Eisenhower returned to the United States in 1939, and this proved to be crucial to his future because had he stayed in the Philippines, he would have been caught up in the Japanese attack and potentially would have been captured on Corregidor in 1942, missing out on World War II. The mobilization of the United States after the fall of France under 1940 brought with it accelerated promotions. And by September 1941, Eisenhower was a brigadier general. Within a year, he would be a lieutenant general. So going from colonel to 3-star general in about a 12-month period. And the break for him came after Pearl Harbor. Marshall, who was the chief staff of the US Army, wanted to know what to do about the Philippines and the Pacific War in general. So he called Eisenhower to Washington, and Eisenhower went into his office thinking that it would just be a meet and greet and Marshall would assign him to some staff duties, but Marshall asked him for his strategic advice. And Eisenhower was kind of put back and he said, "Can you give me a couple minutes?" Which he did. He went out in the anteroom and sometime later he went in and gave Marshall what he thought was his best strategic advice for the prosecution of the Pacific War. Marshall liked the strategy, liked Eisenhower's reasoning and his intellect so much that he made him head of the War Plans Division in the War Department and promoted him to Major General in March 1942. As part of those duties, Eisenhower recommended that Marshall create a single post in London that would oversee the US buildup for operations in Europe. Marshall not only accepted the advice, but he assigned Eisenhower to fill the position. Eisenhower arrived in London on June 25th, 1942, and within a month, he had been promoted yet again to Lieutenant General and named to command Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. And it would be Torch that would be Eisenhower's coming out party. It tested not only his strategic abilities, but his ability to keep an alliance together as well, and his political skills. And it is in this position in which he first met Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the only Allied commander in the war to date who had defeated the Germans in a major battle. Montgomery was particularly conceited and difficult to handle. And I'll turn now to his career. There you go. You can see some more slides of Ike. There he is in North Africa inspecting the wax. And some rare pictures of him earlier in his, not as a 4-star general, or except the lower left, but as a 2- and 3-star general. Okay, so Montgomery. In the summer of 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel won a great victory in the Western Desert in Libya, the Battle of Gazala. And the outcome of that fighting was that the Panzer Army Africa, which he commanded, ended up deep into Egypt, threatening the British position in the Middle East and the Suez Canal, which was obviously a key communications link with the Far East. The British 8th Army finally halted its advance at El Alamein, roughly 90 miles west of the Suez Canal. Churchill was displeased with the leadership of the British forces in the Middle East. And so he sacked both the commander of the overall commander in the Middle East and replaced him with General Sir Harold Alexander. And then he wanted a new commander for the 8th Army as well. And Montgomery took command of the 8th Army. Montgomery was an interesting choice. He hailed from an Irish family of very modest means. He was not necessarily part of the aristocracy, as many British military officers were. In World War I, he was shot through the lung at the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. And that wound and the damage to his lungs led to his aversion to smoking, which was a future cause of friction with the chain smoking Dwight Eisenhower. But we shouldn't overplay that. In the interwar period, Montgomery stood out for his dedication to professionalism, for learning his job, for training his troops, when most of his contemporaries wanted to simply return to the good old days of regimental soldiering. Montgomery had uncompromising standards, and his abrasiveness rubbed his peers the wrong way. Nevertheless, by 1940, he had risen to two-star general and commanded the 3rd Division in the British Expeditionary Forces in France in 1940. And he guided that unit successfully in its withdrawal to Dunkirk, one of the few formations that actually fought pretty well against the Germans. After his evacuation to England, he spent the next 2 years retraining the British Army in southern England. When he was appointed to command of the 8th Army in August 1942, he's actually Churchill's second choice. Churchill's first choice, Lieutenant General William Gott, was killed when his plane was shot down by German fighters en route to Cairo. Gott was already in the Middle East. He had commanded a corps within 8th Army in the Battle of Gazala. Montgomery was an inspired choice. Admittedly, he was a careful, prudent general who rarely took risks. But his approach reflected the caliber of the forces under his command. Thus far in the war, the British Army lacked a coherent combined arms doctrine, varied widely in quality, possessed an officer corps long on pedigree and short on brains, and generally showed an astonishing unwillingness to learn from battlefield experience. Montgomery assumed control and fought a major battle in September in which he blunted Rommel's last attempt to gain the Suez Canal. And then he went over to the offensive. Now, 3 months between the time he assumed command and the Battle of El Alamein was not enough time to correct the considerable deficiencies in 8th Army. So Montgomery conducted the Battle of El Alamein very carefully. The 8th Army was a flawed instrument, and he knew it. And his success in that battle reflected his realistic appreciation of British weaknesses. Montgomery's plan was simple and devised to take advantage of British material superiority made possible by the entry of the United States into the war and by Lend-Lease. British artillery would batter the German and Italian defenders. Engineers would clear lanes through the 500,000 or so mines that had been laid on the battlefield. Infantry would then close with and destroy enemy forces. And finally, the armored forces would be unleashed and exploit deep into Rommel's rear area. Now, El Alamein didn't go like that. It did not go according to plan. There were heavy losses on both sides, but eventually British forces managed, and by British I mean Commonwealth, because there was plenty of other forces along with the English. They were able to decimate Panzer Army Africa and force it to withdraw. Rommel pursued methodically, carefully, not to Churchill's liking, but by the time Rommel reached Tunisia, Montgomery had succeeded in doing something that no other British commander had been able to do. He had won a complete victory over Rommel and his forces and over the Germans. So El Alamein made Montgomery a hero in Britain, for sure, but also in the United States. And it also went to his head. Churchill perhaps summed up Montgomery best: indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. El Alamein was the last battle won exclusively by British and Commonwealth forces. In a sense, It marked the twilight glory of the British Empire. Yet the British could not have won without American materiel. Sherman tanks, Grant tanks, artillery pieces, and so forth. As American contingents increasingly eclipsed British units in the composition of Allied forces, American commanders came to dominate the command structure, much to the chagrin of senior British military leaders who looked down upon their American cousins as second-rate amateurs in the art of war. And this leads us to a discussion of the Allied coalition. Historically, coalitions have been notoriously difficult to manage. The national interests of Allied powers are normally not entirely congruent, and purely national concerns often shape strategy in ways that a single controlling power would never adopt. And alliances can fall apart. At a critical moment during the 7 Years' War, for example, Frederick the Great and Prussia were saved by a collapse on the part of the Allied powers confronting him. Marshal Foch, in the lower left picture there, the French commander who was appointed generalissimo over Allied forces on the Western Front in World War I, was disgusted by the realities and the difficulties of coalition warfare. He said the experience reduced his admiration for Napoleon, since Napoleon had usually fought only coalitions. Indeed, when once asked which European power he preferred to fight, Napoleon's answer was unequivocal: allies. So given these inherent difficulties in alliances, how did the British and Americans work so well together? Well, first they shared basic war aims. They were both democracies. They both detested the Nazi regime, and they both wanted to establish free governments in the countries they planned to liberate from German rule. The Atlantic Charter was an expression of those war aims. Second, Britain and the United States shared a common language, heritage, and culture. And third, and just as importantly, the British and Americans worked very hard to create a workable and integrated command structure. And you can see part of it there in the upper right, the combined chiefs of staff, British and Americans at a table together at one of the many conferences they held during the war. Indeed, the Anglo-American command relationship was a masterwork of coalition warfare. At the theater level, the commander was invariably from the nation which had the most forces engaged. And usually that person was from the branch of service most important for success in that theater. So a general for a land campaign, an air marshal or a general for an air campaign, and an admiral for sea campaigns. And the deputy commander was from the other country. So thus, when General Dwight Eisenhower took command in Europe, his deputy commander was from Great Britain, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder. And key commanders were in part chosen for their diplomatic abilities. Eisenhower was the consummate diplomat, skilled at gaining consensus and cooperation from all involved. High-level headquarters maintained integrated staffs that included both Americans and British officers. And every effort was made to work together cooperatively. General Carl Toohey Spots, one of the 12th Army Air Force commander in North Africa, noted there were 3 deadly crimes a serviceman could commit: murder, rape, and interference with Anglo-American relations. The first 2 might conceivably be pardoned, but the third one, never. In one famous episode, when Eisenhower learned that an American officer had exchanged words with his British counterpart, Ike relieved the American colonel and sent him home to the United States. And the British officer was aghast. He went and defended his American counterpart before Ike, saying, basically, he only called me a son of a bitch, sir. Eisenhower replied, "I am informed that he called you a British son of a bitch. That is quite different. My ruling stands." Some disgruntled officers even thought Eisenhower was a closet Brit. And one of those disgruntled American officers was the larger-than-life Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., who felt that American interests and honor too often took a backseat to British demands. "Goddamn all British and all so-called Americans who have their legs pulled by them," Patton wrote in his diary in North Africa. "Ike is more British than the British and is putty in their hands." Patton was part of, if America had an aristocracy, Patton would have been part of it. He was born to a wealthy California family, so never lacked for means. He enjoyed a privileged childhood, most likely suffered from dyslexia as a child, a handicap that he overcame over time. But later in life, he became a voracious reader. He enjoyed military history and books about the Civil War, a war in which his grandfather and great uncle were killed fighting for the Confederacy. Patton spent a year at the Virginia Military Institute before transferring to West Point. So he had 2 plebe years, or 1 rat year as they're known at VMI, and 1 plebe year at West Point. And then he was forced to repeat his plebe year yet again because of poor academic performance. So he had 3 plebe years. After graduating in 1909, Patton was commissioned in the cavalry branch. A year later, he married the woman in the photo there, Beatrice Banning Ayer, the daughter of a Boston industrial tycoon. So of money, married into money, very wealthy family. Patton represented the United States in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, which I thought fascinating. He competed in the modern pentathlon, which in those days was swimming, pistol shooting, running, fencing, and riding. And he came in a very respectable 5th place. So he was definitely an athlete. After Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa led an attack on the border town of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, Patton joined the staff of Brigadier General John J. Pershing and accompanied him on the punitive expedition into Mexico. Though the mission failed to apprehend Villa, Patton was responsible for leading a raid that killed 3 revolutionaries. Patton was popularly said to have personally shot one of the revolutionaries with his pistol, which is probably not true. But what is true is that he returned to Pershing's headquarters with the 3 dead bodies on the hood, strapped to the hood of his car, making a name for himself. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, Patton accompanied Pershing to France as a member of the staff of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Patton left the headquarters in November 1917 to assume command of the newly formed American Tank Corps. Over the next months, he organized, trained, and even designed the uniforms for the new tank units. And then he led it into battle, first in the St. Mihiel offensive, and then in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where he was badly wounded by machine gun fire. But he survived, and he went on in the interwar period to become a proponent of tanks. He wasn't really able to do anything about this until the fall of France in the summer of 1940, which began US rearmament for World War II and also caused General George C. Marshall to create the armored force that would become Patton's hallmark during World War II. He personally took command of the 2nd Armored Division. And after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he created the Desert Training Center near Indio, California, because the Americans knew that they were likely to end up fighting in North Africa. He then served as commanding general of the Western Task Force, which invaded Casablanca and Morocco in November 1942. He was promoted to after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, to the temporary rank of Lieutenant General in March 1943, where he worked and worked to restore the fighting effectiveness of US forces in Tunisia. It was in North Africa that Patton first met Montgomery, and the two really never got along. Patton despised Montgomery, deriding Monty as a tired little fart. Despite the Americans' improvement on the battlefield, British commanders remained unimpressed with their American counterparts. For their part, Patton and many of his colleagues felt disrespected, especially by Montgomery. Arrogant, egotistical, and assertive, Montgomery irritated both his colleagues and his allies. In many ways, he was not unlike Patton. Patton was a stern disciplinarian and strutted around in a polished steel helmet with a pair of ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his hip. He could also swear like a sailor in his very high-pitched voice, and this is what most people don't understand. He's not George C. Scott with that deep intonation. He had a very high-pitched voice, which was, when you ever do hear a recording of him, takes you back a step or two. Unfortunately, Patton's antipathy towards his British counterparts affected his relationship with his boss, Eisenhower, whose mission it was to keep the alliance partners operating together. Montgomery and Patton would lead British and US forces in the next great invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Montgomery's Eighth Army was designated the main effort. It would land on the island's southeastern shore and then drive north for the critical port of Messina, through which the Germans could either bring forces into the island or withdraw forces from the island. Patton's Seventh Army landed on Montgomery's flank, basically with a mission to protect the British left. After a week of combat, Montgomery was requested and was granted use of routes designated for Patton's army, basically shunting the Seventh Army, the US Seventh Army, off to the side. Patton would have none of it. Monty is trying to steal the show, and with the assistance of Divine Destiny, which was Patton's nickname for Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, D.D. Eisenhower, Divine Destiny, you get it. And with the assistance of Divine Destiny, he may do so, Patton wrote in his diary. Patton realized that if he was to reach Messina before Monty, he had no choice other than to strike north to Palermo on the north coast and then move east along the north shore of the island to Messina. Patton requested the permission to conduct a reconnaissance in force to his front. That permission was granted, and then he took the liberty of turning it into a full-blown offensive to the northwest. When his boss, Field Marshal Harold Alexander, tried to restrain Patton by sending him a new directive, the Seventh Army Chief of Staff, Patton's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, kept part of the message from Patton, ensured that the remainder took a long time to be decoded, and then asked for it to repeat it on the grounds that it had been garbled. By the time new orders arrived, American forces had already arrived in Palermo, and it was a fait accompli. One eyewitness recalled seeing Patton during this time resplendent in an immaculate uniform, complete with necktie neatly tucked into his pressed gabardine shirt, knee-length polished black leather boots, and his ever-present ivory-handled pistols strapped to his waist. With the Eighth Army's attack stalled, you can see there on the right side, this arrow here, and he was just stalled somewhere around here. With Eighth Army's attack stalled, Montgomery met with Patton and offered Patton the use of the routes between Mount Etna, Mount Etna, right here, and the north coast. So he was offering Patton this avenue of approach to Messina. And that meant that Patton would likely reach Messina first. It was never a race between British and American forces, although Patton certainly viewed it as such. He wrote to Troy Middleton, the commander of the 45th Infantry Division, "This is a horse race in which the prestige of the US Army is at stake. We must take Messina before the British. Please use your best efforts to facilitate the success of our race." Patton followed this up with a note to Omar Bradley, who commanded 2nd US Corps. "I want you to get into Messina just as fast as you can. I don't want you to waste your time on these maneuvers, even if you've got to spend men to do it. I want you to beat Monty into Messina." Bradley later stated, "Patton was developing as an unpopular guy. He steamed about with great convoys of cars and great squads of cameramen. To George, tactics was simply a process of bowling ahead. Never seemed to think out a campaign. Seldom made a careful estimate of the situation. I thought him a shallow commander. I disliked the way he worked, upset tactical plans, interfered with my orders. His stubbornness on amphibious operations and his parade plans into Messina sickened me and soured me on Patton. We learned how not to behave from Patton's 7th Army." Now, this is pretty harsh, but certainly was true for Patton in the part of the campaign between Palermo and Messina. But the terrain had something to do with it. If you've ever been to the north coast of Sicily, it's mountain after mountain after mountain, and it's very difficult to maneuver when you're facing mountain after mountain after mountain. Patton would obviously be a much better, much more skilled at maneuver in France. Although a patrol of the 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina on the evening of August 16th, Patton gave orders for it to hold back until he could personally make a triumphant entry into the city. Bradley recalled that we had to hold our troops in the hills instead of pursuing the fleeing Germans in an effort to get as many as we could. The British nearly beat him into Messina because of that. In fact, Montgomery did not expect to beat Patton to Messina, although that is the way this period has come down in history, primarily because of the exciting but ahistorical scene in the movie Patton. In real life, it wasn't Montgomery that met Patton in Messina. It was a British brigadier general. German forces ended up successfully evacuating Sicily, reflecting poorly on the abilities of the Allied command in coordinating operations. Ike and his lieutenants would have to do better next time. But for Patton, the next campaign would have to wait. On August 3rd, Patton stopped by an army hospital outside Nicosia and chatted with several injured soldiers. All were brave and cheerful, he noted. Then he encountered a soldier who had no visible wounds. Patton asked him what was wrong. "I guess I can't take it," the soldier replied. Cursing the soldier as a coward, Patton slapped him with his gloves and pushed him out of the tent. Such men, Patton wrote, should be tried for cowardice and shot. A week later, at another hospital, Patton came across a soldier diagnosed with severe shell shock. Again, Patton erupted. He slapped and cursed the soldier. "I can't help it," he said, "but it makes my blood boil to think of a yellow bastard being babied." Patton didn't understand what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but the 2 slapping incidents nearly ended his 34-year Army career. Reports made their way to Eisenhower and to the media. A furious Eisenhower ordered Patton to apologize to the soldiers involved and their entire chain of command. Ike asked the reporters to refrain from publishing the story for the good of the Allied cause, which amazingly they did. But inevitably, the story broke 3 months later. Eisenhower refused to send his old friend and best commander home, but the public fear ensured that Patton would not command American ground forces in the invasion of Europe, an honor that went to the much less capable Omar Bradley. When Patton finally returned to action in France in command of the Third Army in August 1944, he would do so as subordinate to Omar Bradley and Montgomery. The combined chiefs of staff selected Patton's nemesis, Montgomery, to command the Allied ground forces in Normandy under the overall commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Montgomery and Eisenhower left Italy in late 1944 to return to England to finalize planning for D-Day. They worked together cordially to improve the plan, adding 2 seaborne divisions and 2 airborne divisions to the invasion forces, thereby strengthening the overlord forces. Montgomery envisioned British and Canadian forces making the main effort to seize the crucial communications junction of Caen. American forces to their west would seize the port of Cherbourg and then attack south to expand the lodgment area. But this follows a pattern. The British forces were the main effort in Sicily. Montgomery expected the British forces to be the main effort in Normandy as well. The American forces would be under the command of Omar Bradley, first commander of the 1st U.S. Army, and then later commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group. Bradley was born in rural Missouri and spent his boyhood impoverished, with no thought of a military career until someone suggested that he could apply to West Point and get a free education. Bradley seized the opportunity and he graduated with Eisenhower in the West Point class of 1915. As with Eisenhower, Bradley didn't see combat in World War I. He, like Ike, he thought this would end his career, or at least shortstop him, and he'd end his career as a relatively junior ranking officer. His break came when he was assigned to Fort Benning, the home of the infantry school, which was then under the command of Colonel George C. Marshall. And so he came to Marshall's attention through that assignment. In 1941, Marshall, now Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, reassigned Bradley to command the infantry school. And then later, Bradley was given command of an infantry division, the 82nd Division, which had not yet been turned into an airborne division. In February 1943, Marshall assigned Bradley to North Africa to assist Eisenhower in the aftermath of the disastrous defeat at Kasserine Pass. Ike sent Bradley to 2nd Corps, basically to see what was up with that unit. But on the recommendation of the new Corps commander, Patton, Bradley was assigned as his deputy. He later succeeded Patton as commander of the 2nd Corps, which Bradley led during the final days of the campaign in Tunisia and during the Sicilian campaign in the summer of 1943. But his big break, besides being under Marshall's eye in the interwar period, was the slapping incidents. Because when Patton was sidelined after those slapping incidents, Eisenhower selected Bradley to command the 1st U.S. Army in Operation Overlord. Hailed as the GI general, Bradley was competent but pedestrian as a commander. He had earned his nickname via the pen of Ernie Pyle, the famed war correspondent, who had been directed by Eisenhower to go to Sicily and, quote, discover Bradley, unquote. Bradley didn't like Patton and perhaps even feared him. But Bradley had the foresight to unleash Patton when the time came, putting them both into the history books. But Bradley, like I said, made a lot of mistakes. On D-Day, his fire support plan failed on Omaha Beach, where roughly 3,000 US soldiers died. His army soon ran headlong into the worst of the hedgerow terrain of the Bocage in Normandy, a terrain that he and his intelligence officers underneath him failed to predict. The campaign was a meat grinder. Montgomery could do no better, stuck at Caen, facing the cream of German Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions in the West. To his credit, Bradley came up with a solution to the deadlock. He would concentrate 3 infantry divisions along a 6,000-mile front and blast a hole open in the front with the concentrated use of heavy bombers. The bombing was botched. By who remains in dispute more than 75 years later, leading to hundreds of deaths from friendly fire. But the plan succeeded. Operation Cobra, as it was known, tore open a hole in the front and finally unleashed Patton, whom Eisenhower had reprieved and restored to command of the 3rd U.S. Army. Patton knew where he was going, even if Bradley did not. Operation Cobra resulted in a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to encircle the entire German army in Normandy and destroy it. Patton's army pursued south to Avranches, right here. And then he could either swing west into Brittany, according to the pre-invasion plan, to seize the ports over here, or he could move east to potentially encircle the entire German army in Normandy. Bradley ordered him to go into Brittany, the wrong direction, despite the fact that German demolitions at the port of Cherbourg should have indicated that the ports in Brittany, even if they could be taken quickly, would be useless for months to come. Hitler, however, recognized the threat and ordered the Germans to counterattack at Mortain, right here, this arrow. As the panzer divisions counterattacked towards Avranches, the ultra intelligence from Bletchley Park warned the Americans and the British what was about to come, and Bradley was able to mass fighter bombers and artillery to blunt the German spearhead. At that point, Patton's divisions finally turned east, and they went to Le Mans and then up north to Argentan, right around here. And Patton wanted to continue. He wanted to surround the German army in Normandy and destroy it. He facetiously told Bradley that he could drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk. But Bradley preferred, in his words, a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise. He was risk averse. And this risk aversion led him to pass up the opportunity for a major victory that probably would have ended the war in 1944 had it been successfully executed. Anglo-American forces eventually closed the gap at Falaise, but not until 50,000 of Germany's best troops escaped the pocket, leaving most of their equipment behind. But at this point, Germany's factories were still churning out plenty of gear to re-equip them on the German border. During the planning for the Normandy invasion, Eisenhower demanded a supporting invasion in the south of France. Stalin actually wanted this operation to occur as well. And it was Churchill who wanted to use the troops earmarked for the invasion of southern France to go into the Balkans instead. Roosevelt left the decision in Eisenhower's hands. Eisenhower remained firm, and Churchill, chagrined, changed the name of the invasion from Operation Anvil to Operation Dragoon because he had been dragooned into accepting it. But this was really a critical invasion, and it shows you Eisenhower's gift as a strategist, because the ports of Marseille and Toulon were taken intact. And through those ports flowed about 1/3 of the supplies destined for Allied forces in Northwest Europe. Paris fell to Free French forces on August 25th, and by early September, Montgomery had captured Brussels. More importantly, his Guards Armored Division captured the port of Antwerp intact, with all of its docks intact, all of its machinery. And had the British opened up the port of Antwerp to supplies, it could have shortened the war by a matter of weeks, if not months. But Montgomery did not attend to the opening of the Scheldt estuary, which connects Antwerp to the sea. He had to be ordered by Eisenhower to do this, attend to it personally. And by the time Montgomery got around to doing it, the Scheldt estuary was not cleared until early November, and the first ship was not able to dock at Antwerp until the end of that month. This was a major opportunity missed. Montgomery's failure to take the Scheldt estuary in September allowed 80,000 troops of the German 15th Army to escape to fight another day. And Allied supplies grew thin. In Lorraine, Patton's tanks ran out of gas. US and British forces were able to close up to the German frontier and penetrate the West Wall in a few places, but they lacked the logistical capacity for anything more than that. Instead, Montgomery made a bid to end the war with a daring but ultimately futile operation to use airborne troops to seize a series of bridges in Holland and cross the Rhine River into the Ruhr industrial region. It was the largest airborne assault in history, but its failure brought to an end the Allied pursuit of German forces. Even if successful, though, it probably would not have achieved its operational objectives because the Allied logistical situation required all of the supplies to be trucked all the way from the beaches of Normandy because of Montgomery's failure to open up the Scheldt estuary. The Allied advance then slowed to a crawl as logistical realities caught up with the British and American forces that had outrun their supply system. They had difficulty coming up to an agreement on what to do next. Montgomery wanted a single thrust advance, commanded by him naturally, north of the Ruhr. Eisenhower rather decided to support all the armies more or less equally. This was known as the broad front advance. It might not have been the greatest operational concept in the world, but it kept the Allies together. What it did not do was defeat the German army in the West. Montgomery's forces inched their way towards the Rhine. Bradley allowed Courtney Hodges, who had taken command of the First Army, to lead that army into the Hurtgen Forest, where division after division was chewed up in some of the worst fighting of the campaign for Northwest Europe. The Germans tenaciously defended the Hurtgen Forest because behind it were the staging areas for what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. There were indications that such an attack was coming, but the major orders for what was called Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, were sent via telephone and not via radio. So the Allied commanders used to ultra-intelligence had no explicit warning of a German counteroffensive upcoming. Bradley had thinned the lines in the Ardennes forest, using the area as a testing ground for divisions new to combat or veteran divisions refitting after the brutal combat in the Hurtgen Forest. There were no reserves available other than the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, which Eisenhower retained control over after their battles in Holland. The German attack on December 16th caught Bradley's forces by surprise. Only desperate stands by widely scattered units delayed the Panzer spearheads long enough for reinforcements to be rushed to the Ardennes. And this was Eisenhower's doing. He immediately rushed the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to the front, took the 7th Armored Division from the 9th US Army up north and sent it to the front as well. But it was Patton who was best prepared. When the 3rd US Army intelligence officer reported the initial German attacks, Patton sensed what was happening and ordered the staff to prepare a plan to turn 2 corps north and counterattack into the southern German flank. When the Allied commanders met at a conference in Eisenhower's headquarters in Paris, Patton advised, "Hell, let's have the guts to let the sons of a bitch go to Paris. Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." He offered to counterattack with 3 divisions within 48 hours, a timeline that took the other commanders at the table aback. But Patton already had the plans in motion. What he needed was air cover. So he ordered his chaplain to compose a prayer for good weather. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared. The Allied air forces pounded the Germans. Third Army forces broke through to relieve the battling bastards of Bastogne, and Patton decorated his chaplain with a silver star. Now, to simplify command and control, Eisenhower turned the northern portion of the Bulge over to Montgomery, this portion up here. Montgomery made sound tactical decisions, and then, having made a very considerable contribution to victory, he threw it all away, all the goodwill away that he had earned, by announcing at a press conference that he had basically saved the Americans. Eisenhower at this point nearly demanded that either he or Montgomery be relieved of command. But at the instigation of Montgomery's chief of staff, Montgomery wrote Ike a profuse note of apology, and that papered relations over. Churchill, with a better understanding of the situation than his battlefield commander, went before Parliament on January 18th to announce in no uncertain terms that the Bulge was an American battle and an American victory. Wet, cold, and miserable winter weather initially prevented the Allies from taking immediate advantage of the German weaknesses, but they were able to penetrate the Rhine barrier in 3 places come March. The main effort in the north was the British 21st Army Group, which prepared for a massive assault across the Rhine River in Montgomery's traditional fashion. Patton and Bradley moved more quickly. On March 7th, the 9th Armored Division reached the Rhine River at Remagen and seized intact the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge over the Rhine. You can see that in the upper right-hand corner. And Bradley was able to stuff a number of divisions to the east bank of the Rhine River, crossing the Rhine that way. Not to be outdone, Patton's 3rd U.S. Army cracked the German defensive positions on the western bank of the river. And then he had a division cross the Rhine River at Oppenheim on March 22nd. Not surprisingly, Patton then crammed everything he could across the river and smilingly reported to Bradley that he had snuck a division across during the night. On his way back across the Rhine River, this picture is in the lower right, Patton stopped long enough to pee into the Rhine River. The next day, in reference to Montgomery's coming deliberate assault, Patton's briefing officer reported, "Without benefit of aerial bombing, ground smoke, artillery preparation, and airborne assistance, 3rd Army at 2200 hours Thursday, March 22nd, crossed the Rhine River." A little jab into Montgomery with his press release. Montgomery, of course, did cross the Rhine River with a massive artillery bombardment, an airborne landing by 2 divisions, and a massive assault. And his forces quickly exploited around the north side of the Ruhr, while American forces exploited the south side. They met up, trapping German forces in the Ruhr industrial region and pretty much ending the battle for control of Germany in the west. Nothing remained except a few pockets of fanatical Nazis to hinder the advance of the Anglo-American forces into the heart of the Third Reich. Along the way, they at last discovered the grisly realities of the German concentration camp system. Eisenhower and his lieutenants did not work perfectly together, but they managed to work together well enough to accomplish their mission of annihilating the Wehrmacht and entering the heart of Germany to destroy the Nazi regime. Eisenhower, of course, went on to become a beloved 2-term president, just as Ulysses S. Grant had done after the Civil War. Montgomery went on to serve as chief of the Imperial General Staff, convinced to his dying day that he was one of the 3 great warrior generals in the history of the world. The other 2, according to him, were Alexander the Great and Napoleon. Bradley's image as the GI general made him a popular hero, and he would retain significant prestige through his post-war military and civilian careers. Then came the movie Patton in 1970, and with it, George C. Scott's resurrection of George S. Patton Jr. as a full-blown cultural icon. Bradley served as the movie's technical advisor, making him a small fortune. But this is also the reason why his character, played by Carl Malden, emerges looking pretty good. But Patton, long dead, reemerged as a legend, while Bradley's legacy has become tarnished somewhat by military historians like me, critical of his generalship. His fire support plan failed at Omaha Beach, his army was unprepared for the hedgerows of Normandy, and he badly botched the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest and his initial response to the Battle of the Bulge. He was, in many ways, like Montgomery. His methodical approach to operations could be overly cautious, allowing fleeting opportunities, such as at the Falaise Gap, to slip away. And with that, my presentation is concluded, and I stand by for your questions.
Thanks so much, Pete. That hit the nail on the head for an awful lot of us. That clears up a lot of questions, interaction between or amongst generals. My question is, there's two of them. One of them deals with Patton and Eisenhower. Patton's insubordination, how that affected Eisenhower. You kind of hit up on that, but I wonder if you could go into any more detail if that's possible.
Is insubordination in what way?
Just by slapping those guys.
Okay, so the slapping incidents.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And then the press on Eisenhower's case, the pressure that he got to fire Patton, but yet he stood by him. Then another question, which is totally unrelated. The wives, Eisenhower's wife, Mamie, how'd they keep their marriage alive, being separated like that, or Patton keep his marriage alive, being separated like that, knowing that there's rumors flying on both sides of the fence. And I don't want to get into that really, but I just curious how they kept their marriages alive as well. So it's a two questions, totally unrelated.
Yeah, so this was an era in which officers were forgiven more often than they are today. So today, if you make a misstep, you tend to be relieved of command. And you retire. That's the end of your career. This was not the case back then. Officers could be relieved of division command, for instance, and given another division, which was the case of Terry de la Mesa Allen. They could be relieved and end up becoming a staff officer in the Pentagon and serving 10 more years, which was the case of Eugene Landrum. So Patton clearly had done something that was egregious. Eisenhower knew it. He was incensed. But he also knew that Patton would be needed, that America lacked, the United States Army lacked experienced battlefield commanders, and Patton was the most experienced battlefield commander they had. And he would be needed in the coming campaign in Northwest Europe. So he held firm that Patton should not be sent back to the United States. He was used sort of as a decoy, held around the Sardinia, Sardinia, and the Germans would track his movements and so forth. So that made the Germans perhaps think that the Allies were planning an invasion of southern France, which indeed they were. So that was no surprise. He was eventually taken to Britain and given command of Third Army. The idea that he would, this was like the movie, right, where he's told at the last minute, you have Third Army, that he knew months ahead of time that he was going to command Third Army. But Eisenhower was firm that he didn't want Patton sent back to the United States, because who did he have who could command an army? Bradley, the most he had commanded was a corps, and now he was going to be an army commander and soon to be an army group commander. And as I noted, he didn't do all that well. I mean, he did okay. So that's how Patton survived. his friendship with Eisenhower, Eisenhower's assessment of his capabilities as a commander kept him in the fight. But had he not slapped those soldiers, Patton would have likely, the roles of Patton and Bradley would have been reversed. Patton would have been the overall US commander in the battle for France. And it's a great counterfactual question of what would have happened in that case. In terms of relationships with their wives, so both Patton and Eisenhower were accused of having affairs. Patton's was in the interwar period, though, like in 1936. He had basically his step-niece came through, or not a step-niece, but his wife had a half-sister, and her daughter came through Hawaii. She was about 20 years Patton's junior. Patton was caught sneaking off to another island with her. So it was widely assumed they were having an affair, which is probably the case. There's no definitive word. When he came back and he was confronted by Beatrice, he was very apologetic. And as far as we know, that didn't happen again, but Beatrice held it against her niece from that point on, gave her a Hawaiian curse at one point. So when Patton went off to war, you know, he was doing what he thought he was destined to do. And Beatrice was able to take that as an army wife, and she was of means. So it wasn't like she was suffering in substandard quarters or anything like that. And Patton, you know, died before he came back. So she became a widow shortly after the end of the war. Eisenhower is a different case. He was totally faithful to his wife, Mamie, until he was assigned a driver, Kay Summersby, who was a very good-looking British officer. I think actually Eisenhower promoted her to captain in the US Army. But anyway, they had what she initially said was a platonic relationship. But at the very end of her life, as she was dying of cancer, she wrote a book called Past Forgetting, in which she said, no, they kissed on several occasions, and it was more than just a platonic relationship. Eisenhower, when he came back from the war, though, left her behind. I'm not sure he had to patch things up with Mamie, but he was able to continue his marriage, and it became, you know, obviously very successful, as Mamie Eisenhower became the first lady, and they lived together till their dying days. I suppose, you know, the closest parallel we have to it today is Petraeus, General Petraeus, my old boss, who had an affair for sure. And he's still with his wife, and probably will be now for the rest of their days, having patched things over. You know, wives back then, especially if you were an army wife, they expected to have to spend long periods of time away from their husbands, especially in wartime. So this was not unusual.
Thank you.
There's a few questions. I think we have time for a few. This one is not necessarily related, but there's a question: who was Eisenhower's best, most valuable subordinate? We'll probably discount her and think of someone else.
Who was Eisenhower's best, most valuable subordinate? You know, I think that Beadle Smith, his chief of staff, gets short shrift because he was a staff officer, but he really kept SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, functioning. And I think Eisenhower leaned on him pretty heavily. So, you know, that would be my nominee.
Another question: what about other Army commanders in Eisenhower's team, such as Simpson?
Yeah, so Simpson was a commander of of 9th U.S. Army. There was also General Patch, who commanded an army group in the southern part of the front in France. So there were other subordinates that Eisenhower dealt with for sure, but perhaps not as colorful as Patton. So if you look at the three army groups, it would be Montgomery, Bradley, and then Patch. But the army group that Patch commanded was in a portion of the front, which was not. It was certainly a supporting effort for the main effort in Bradley and Montgomery's area, which is why Eisenhower's relationship with Patch doesn't really get a lot of play, and it's not as important, quite frankly. In terms of Army commanders, Simpson commanded 9th U.S. Army under Montgomery. He was a very capable commander, but because he worked for Montgomery, Eisenhower really didn't have a lot of dealings with him.
There's a question from Seth. He says, it seems that for other than his ego, Montgomery was highly overrated and was really a legend in his own mind. Would you agree?
No, I disagree. Now, his ego was an issue, and his personality was an issue, but he was the right commander for the British at the right time. They simply had so many problems with their doctrine and their army culture that they couldn't fix it in the war years. And so they needed someone like Montgomery, who understood the weaknesses of the forces under his command, who fought very centralized, tightly controlled battles, who could mass firepower. And look, Montgomery only lost one battle, Operation Market Garden. He was successful everywhere else. So he really, I think, deserves a lot of credit, but he almost throws the credit away because of his outrageous statements that he had saved the Americans in the Battle of the Bulge, that after the war that he was one of the three great warrior generals of history and so forth. So he's easy to dislike, but he was actually a very important part of Allied victory.
A follow-up question related to Montgomery from Stephanie is, did Montgomery work well with any of his peers, and how did Eisenhower handle his personality quirks?
Eisenhower did not get along with his peers. His subordinates worked okay with him. But he graded his peers the wrong way because of his very abrasive personality. Eisenhower, should be sainted for his ability to handle Montgomery. Before Operation Market Garden, Montgomery asked to meet with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower's like, okay, come on down, I'll meet with you. And Montgomery's like, no, I need you to come up here to my headquarters. And Eisenhower did it. He flew to Montgomery's headquarters and then sat through a tongue lashing by Montgomery on why Ike's strategy was all screwed up. And at one point, Eisenhower, patted him on the knee and he goes, careful, Monty, I'm your boss. You can't treat me this way. It's amazing that, Eisenhower had the patience of a saint in dealing with Montgomery. It finally came to a head, though, in the Battle of the Bulge when Monty, in what was the largest and most costly battle in U.S. military history. Let's just put that, wrap your arms around that thought. The Battle of the Bulge. Montgomery says that saved the Americans. Eisenhower was ready to basically send a telegram to the Joint Chiefs saying, fire him or fire me. I cannot work with him anymore. And it was Freddie de Guingwand, I'm slaughtering the pronunciation of the name. It was Montgomery's chief of staff who intercepted, basically Beadle Smith said, this is what's going to happen. And he wrote, Montgomery's chief of staff wrote a note of apology, took it into Montgomery and said, you will be on the first plane back to England and you will lose command if you do not sign this letter. and he had drafted the letter for him. And Montgomery finally had realized what he had done and signed the letter. They sent it to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was still miffed, but he was mollified enough and took the apology at face value. So he was able to work with him that way.
One last question about Eisenhower. It's felt that he's felt to be a better general than a president. What do you think?
I think he was a great president. I think historians are looking back on Eisenhower's presidency, and they're presidents actually sometimes get resurrected by historians, saying they were really better than you thought they were. Some not so much though. But Eisenhower, his presidency, historians have looked back and saying he did a much better job with the economy, with defense, with all the things that a president can do, much better. At the time he was kind of seen, oh, he's just a figurehead. He goes out and he's golfing and whatnot. But this was sort of an image he cultivated. He was very much in charge during his presidency. So I think like Grant's presidency looks better in retrospect as well. Both of them did a great job, both as senior commanders and as presidents. They both had their failings in both regards as well, but I think the good far outweighs the bad.
Well, I think that's all we have for questions. And Ski, I don't know if you want to take it over.
Yes,
Words?
yeah, I do. I want to thank the attendees who I'm going to use the word carve time out of their day in a unique fashion. We don't want to do Zooms too much. I know Pete and Craig and John and Frank probably felt it difficult to speak into a computer when they don't have any interaction from the audience. That's difficult to do. They did remarkably well. I was thrilled with what they were able to pull off, not knowing really quite what to expect. And I also commend the attendees for sticking with a unique format for the entire moment in time that we had. Next year, Lord willing, on March the 5th, 2022, our symposium will meet live. Lord willing. We have selected a topic dealing with emancipation and slavery, some things that are pertinent somewhat to today and to whatever other times. We have some speakers lined up to contact, but that's what it's going to be for next year. We would like to have some feedback on your thoughts on integrating World War II with the Civil War. When Pete asked me, why are you doing this? I did not come up with a very good answer. However, Natalie did. She said, well, just think about this. In 2011, the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War was being commemorated, and that's when the symposium began. And we intended to go from 2011 to 2015 and then cease to exist. However, due to the popularity of the symposium, needless to say, we have continued. Well, this is 2021. It marks the 80th year since America's entry into World War II. So there is a nice tie that way, and I can't take credit for that. I'll give that credit to Natalie. You all know what happened in 1941 on December 7th, and then declaring war on December the 8th. That's no secret. That is what we attempted to do today, and I believe strongly that it was done extremely well by our speakers. But I would like some feedback from the audience. Now, how that's going to happen, you see the Clark County Historical Society gmail.com. If you could write that down and contact and just send in your thoughts, just to give us some words of advice for perhaps for future symposia like this.
Attendees will also receive a survey. I believe it should get to you on Monday. you'll receive a survey, and anyone that attended this will be, once we get the videos converted and up online, we'll be sending links to everybody who registered so that you can watch anything that you may have missed. And we have, people that weren't able to stay all day today so that they can watch some of that. But the survey will be coming out in an email automatically to all registered attendees. So we ask that you give some of the feedback there, but also you can use the email